Great. Thank you, Damien. Thank you, Matt. Welcome everybody to, I believe this is the 9th meeting officially. I don't know if they're actually officially numbered, but for the 11th of August for the Housing Production Advisory Council. I'll be turning it over to, do you want to do the consent agenda then, Damien? Or well, sure. Actually, Matt will have to do attendance first. We should probably do attendance first.
All right. I don't see Senator Jama. Senator Anderson.
Present. Thank you.
I don't know. I don't think I see representatives Dexter or Helfrich. Director Bell.
Yep, here.
Director Bateman.
Here. Good afternoon.
Co-Chair Hall.
Here. Hello, everybody.
Co-Chair Tuvey.
Here.
Councilmember Bunn.
Present.
Councilmember Flagan.
Here.
Councilmember Gertler.
Here.
Councilmember Olson.
Here.
Councilmember Mills.
Present.
Councilmember Fonseca.
Present.
Councilmember Rajbaida.
Here.
Councilmember Matthews.
Here.
Councilmember Madsen.
Here. Good afternoon.
Councilmember Wood.
Here.
Councilmember Rockwell.
Here.
Councilmember Van Vliet.
Here.
Councilmember Janney.
Here.
Councilmember Hill.
Here.
And Councilmember Justice is not available at this meeting. And then Councilmember Cody.
Here. Thank you.
All right, I will pass it back to the co-chairs.
Sounds like we got a quorum. So today is going to be in our process for doing the reviews for the recommendations you guys have been working on. So obviously I want to thank everybody for their hard work and all the meetings that you guys have had over the last month or so, getting this all prepared. And I think at the very beginning, we'll start off with the consent agenda for some additional recommendations and assignments going into the next month. So do you want to go ahead and handle that, Damien?
Yeah, gladly. Yep. As always with the consent agenda, we're just going to call a vote on it, and council members can pull anything from the consent agenda that you'd like to discuss further, knowing that this vote is only to send things to the work groups to do more of an in-depth dive. I think we're in screen sharing it, so I don't know if anybody's got hands up or anything along those lines. So just come off mute if you want at any time during this process and ask questions. But otherwise, I'd accept a motion to approve the consent agenda.
I'd like to motion to approve the consent agenda.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, fantastic. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye or raising your hand electronically. Aye.
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 All right. And then
Aye.
giving folks a moment here, hearing a good amount of ayes, really appreciate it. This is the time for anybody who'd like to vote in opposition to the motion to approve the consent agenda. And this is the time for any council members that would like to abstain from voting. All right, consent agenda passes unanimously. Thank you, folks. And I think we'll kick it back over to Matt for just a review on where we are in the review process and our 3-step process that we should consider maybe being a 2-step process if we have non-controversial recommendations, just so that we are doing things expediently. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Co-Chair Hall. So this is just a kind of a reminder for council members and for the public. of the process that the Housing Production Advisory Council will go through to consider recommendations. And so the council has 5 work groups. They're working through a very large number of concepts and potential recommendations. And there's the process that the work groups will go through to engage with subject matter experts and key stakeholders before a recommendation comes to the full council. Once a recommendation does come to the full council, we consider those recommendations in essentially large groupings just to facilitate it administratively. And each set of recommendations goes through a 2 to 3 meeting process. The first meeting, which has already occurred for this set of recommendations, is where the work group chairs or the work group leads present the recommendation to the full council. The council can have some discussion and ask for follow-up questions, follow-up information. And then the second meeting, which we are in, is the opportunity for the council to hear public comment and public testimony on each of the recommendations. At the second meeting, the council can then discuss it further and ask for additional information or make changes if that is what the council is looking for based on follow-up from the first meeting, as well as public comment and testimony. The council can also choose and then to carry that over to a third meeting for further discussion, or the council can choose to preliminarily adopt the recommendations. In the context of the objective of the Housing Production Advisory Council, the objective is that by the end of the year, the council will adopt a full slate of recommendations to the governor on actions the state should consider to increase housing production. And so leading up to the end of the year, when the council does take action prior to December to adopt any recommendations, they are preliminary recommendations until November, December, when the council will be deciding on their official final slate of recommendations to complete the work of the body. So that is the process that we're going through.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matthew, for the reminder. Members of the council, any questions before we start implementing that process and jumping into our meeting number 2 on round 1 of recommendations? All right. Just as context and as an aside, we're amongst the co-chairs and Matthew and the chairs of the work group meetings, we're having discussions about how to kind of optimize the process and outreach and public testimony, with recognition that there's likely to be higher volumes of both public testimony and recommendations that we're considering at future meetings of the HPAC. So, if you have any thoughts about that offline, feel free to reach out. But I think we've got to get through the process once before we really dig in and figure out how to optimize. But I think we've got a manageable load for today, and we will reserve the right to figure out whether we need special meetings or however that's going to work as we have more and more workload, I think, towards the end of the year. So with that said, round 1 of recommendations. Matthew, did you want to kick off comments about public testimony and who's signed up and who's on the line and all that?
Yeah, sure thing. So we had a few pieces of written testimony that were submitted in advance. And so we've packaged that up and sent it out to the full council. Hopefully you all have had a chance to look at that, or you can pull it up. And for members of the public, we'll also be posting that online this afternoon so that everyone can see the public testimony that was submitted. We've had 3 people sign up in advance without identifying a specific specific recommendation. And so we'll call on them first to provide any public testimony or comment that they have. And then we'll go through each of the recommendations. And for the attendees of the webinar, if they are interested in testifying, please raise your hand and I will facilitate calling on folks. And we ask that everyone keep their testimony to 3 minutes, I'll have a timer up, and just do the best you can to keep that testimony to 3 minutes. So the first individual.
Before we jump into that, I just add one thing, right? To clarify, while we didn't require that everybody identify their topic immediately or in advance, the idea is that this is not testimony on things that are not on the agenda. So the recommendations that are in front of the HPAC, there are an almost infinite number of topics related to housing production and an infinite number of opinions. This is testimony on the 4 recommendations that we're talking about today. And so the 4 folks who are going to testify, we do really want to hear about your opinions on those 4 recommendations. Let's go from there.
Great. First up is, I don't see this person on the attendee list. So if you are here under a different name, please raise your hand. Is John Hanna of the Modular Building Institute. Okay, maybe John's not with us. So we will go next is Dan Pauly from the City of Wilsonville. All right, go ahead, Dan.
Hello. Can you hear me okay? Great.
Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
Overall, some good ideas coming out, and I'll comment on all 4 of the concepts. So appreciate the opportunity and look forward to continue being engaged in this process. We have a lot of questions about details at this point. We have some concerns about feasibility and unintended consequences. And we encourage continued work specifically around infrastructure costs and finding an equitable way to financially support and remove barriers to housing supportive infrastructure. First, regarding the revolving infrastructure loan concept, it's a promising idea in our view. Designing such a program, great care should be taken to make sure it is well balanced to incentivize affordable units based on market trade-offs with infrastructure costs. The program would need to be strategic and targeted to have the largest impact rather than distributing smaller amounts widely that don't really move the needle for developers. So I'll leave that one. Next, I want to go to the concept of expanding the BCD capacity and providing plan review. Concerns here is the inability of BCD to coordinate with engineering and planning on concurrent plan review, which we highly value that collaboration across different disciplines, and how that would work is unclear. And that BCD staff want to understand local code and the interrelatedness and provide that joint customer service to clients. Concerned that hiring of extra BCD staff would likely take away from local government and out of a field that is already difficult to hire in for local government. And that also plays into the ability to really timely review applications or resolve disputes. On the digital inspections that was mentioned in the proposal, that's something that's already going on. Just would caution about adding things that would complicate local efforts that are ongoing. Anything is best practices guide or grants for local purchase of technology. We also appreciate the creative thinking around leveraging state-owned land, but have a lot of questions about the details, particularly how local planning and amenities availability play into determining the suitability of sites, as well as will the sites be well served by multimodal transportation, transit options to support state goals, such as reducing per capita VMT. So the removing barriers to condo construction, that's something that consistently we've been supportive of. Cautions there, make sure enhanced local inspection requirements are reasonable and feasible. And also we'd caution that new condo regulations don't allow circumvention of reasonable subdivision and public improvement requirements. So I will leave it at that. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thanks, Dan. And just because you were commenting on all of the recommendations, if you need a little extra time to wrap up the comments, just let me know.
Yeah, I can add just one thing that was a concern that I kind of didn't include because of the short time, was in some of the drafting of the table of how to do the infrastructure loan concept. One thing that we've really been trying to, the market tends to build larger homes because, you know, once you get the bathroom, and the kitchen built, it's cheap to add that extra space, relatively speaking. And so seeing in that table that even for market rate that you get a higher reimbursement of the loan for having larger homes is kind of counter to what we've been working on in some of our master planning and efforts to encourage the smaller units that reflect demographic trends and to anticipated demand for the smaller single level type units. So certainly there's more detail to work out there, but that's something that we want to keep in mind, that we're just incentivizing the right units, and that, I mean, there's a lot of careful thought that needs to go into that type of loan forgiveness concept.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Okay, and then the second individual who signed up in advance, Ariel Nelson with the League of Oregon Cities. Okay, Ariel, are you there?
Hi there, can you hear me?
We got you.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm not sure if I'm supposed to turn on my camera, but I'm not able to. Appreciate you having me here. And I apologize, it wasn't clear what the structure was going to be, or that we would have a time limit when I signed up. So I will do my best to adjust my talking points accordingly. My name is Ariel Nelson.
Ariel, how many recommendations are you testifying on? All four?
All four. I can point to some general themes that apply to all four and then get into specifics as you go through the recommendations. Would that be helpful?
If you have comments on all four, maybe if you could just give some general comments now, and then I'll call you again for each of the recommendations when we're accepting just general public testimony of raising hands. Will that work for you?
That sounds great. Thank you. All right. Thanks, Matt. So for the group, or those who don't know me, I'm Ariel Nelson with the League of Oregon Cities. We are the association representing all 241 incorporated cities around the state. And so that's large cities, small, urban, rural, suburban. They are all experiencing severe housing needs and are actively working to encourage housing development, both for ownership and rental, various types of housing, especially affordable housing, both our publicly funded affordable housing and housing affordable to more moderate incomes. So very much in support of the work you are all doing. Cities are facing a range of barriers across the state. It looks slightly different varying levels of available resources and capacity, opportunities. This is all different across the state, but the two things they all have in common is the need for infrastructure and local capacity to do the approvals and to encourage the housing. So really appreciate the ability to, we've had some cities experts be able to participate, and in some cases, or to observe, and then in some cases participate in the work group discussions. And we recognize that the recommendations before you today and the ones coming forward in the future are all a work in progress. A lot of our comments will be in the details, and also really appreciating the individual council members who have been reaching out to myself or to cities specifically. We just want to make sure that these recommendations are going to be implementable. And also wanted to note that the majority of cities who have been able to participate and connect with the council are larger cities who are naturally more resourced, have deeper staff benches and capacity to lend someone to spend time in these meetings. And we need to consider the statewide impact of the policy recommendations coming forward and ensure that they're going to be crafted in such a way that they're going to have the desired impact across the state in different types of communities. So just wanted to flag that. And again, thank you for the opportunity to weigh in today. When you get to the individual recommendations, I do have some specific notes, and just want to urge the council and encourage you to continue working with your city partners and hope that we can have some more dedicated conversations. And I'm your resource here at the League to ensure we have adequate, appropriate representation from around the state, from different sizes, different perspectives, because I'm sure, as you've heard, or as you may know, strategies are going to look different and have different impacts on the ground in different parts of the state. So just want to thank you again, and available to talk in more detail as you get to the recommendations.
Great. Thank you, Ariel. So we're going to go ahead and move to, oh, Dagny, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, Brian Hoop said he would also like to speak.
Oh, great. And Brian Hoop will be up next for some general testimony, and then we'll go through recommendation by recommendation. Brian, go ahead.
Hi, this is Brian Hoop, Executive Director with Housing Oregon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. At our Portland Metro Policy Council meeting this week, it was our one policy council had an opportunity to look at these recommendations. There were about 38 of our members who participated, and they wholeheartedly endorsed all 4. So I'll just briefly share a few comments related to 2 of them. The first, leveraging state-owned and leased land for housing production. We believe the potential for utilizing state-owned and leased land for housing production is a strategic move in the right direction. What we also wish to offer specific feedback to enhance its impact is proposing prioritizing housing proposals by nonprofit organizations and housing authorities. We'd like to see projects with 99-year affordability agreements given additional consideration for priority in this process. And additionally, we strongly advocate for prioritizing projects primarily sponsored by organizations led for and by BIPOC communities, recognizing the importance of equitable representation and impact. And I forgot to mention my coworker Kevin submitted written comments just moments before this meeting started, so you might not get them till a little bit later. And then the other comment was the 4th recommendation, creating State of Oregon Infrastructure Fund. We wholeheartedly agree the establishment of a State of Oregon Infrastructure Fund has the potential to significantly bolster affordable housing projects. And while we endorse this recommendation, we urge careful consideration to ensure that infrastructure funds are channeled effectively to support affordable housing initiatives as a priority over market rate affordable housing developments. And by strategically directing these funds, we can maximize a positive impact on housing accessibility and affordability. So thanks for your leadership, public service, and for considering our endorsement and comments.
Great. Thank you, Brian. So we will now, it looks like we have one other individual with their hand up to give some general testimony before we move into the recommendation by recommendation testimony. Mayor Keebler of Bend.
Thank you, Matt. And I apologize. I logged on a little late, and I think I raised my hand prematurely because I would like to testify on a particular recommendation. So I'll put the hand back down. Thank you.
Oh, great. Okay, so it looks like that's it for the general testimony, and we're going to go ahead then. For those that would like to provide testimony on the use leveraging state-owned and leased land for housing production, please raise your hand, and we will start off with Ariel Nelson from the League of Oregon Cities. Ariel, you there?
Can you hear me? Sorry.
We got you.
Sorry, it's not clear when it gets activated. Thank you. So my question or my comments are fairly brief on the availability of land. Generally support exploring these possibilities. There's certainly a good amount in communities around the state that there's some potential there. We just, I think similar to what the city of Wilsonville shared, just urge, want to think about that key coordination with local governments when identifying these areas. You know, the majority of places that are going to be suitable for housing and denser housing are going to be located in cities. So we want to make sure we can align timelines, processes, and identifying, the critical services and infrastructure that will be needed to support the housing. And then on the piece related to expanding and extending the emergency order to include directing state agencies to prioritize production, definitely support that. And I would just encourage that council to, again, seek recommendations and insight from your local government city partners who are familiar with many of the overlapping and sometimes contradicting state requirements and processes, and would be very interested in identifying some efficiencies there with our state partners. So those are my comments for availability of lands.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else interested in providing comment on publicly owned land for housing?
Matthew, quick question, Damien here. If I'm the only one that this is happening to, let me know, but all I can see is your screen and the countdown and not any visual of the testifying folks. Is that something we can fix, or is that where we're at for today?
I'll take down the share and I'll just keep track of the timer on my end and just let folks know when their time is up.
Okay, and just as far as like next process, I think if we can see the timer and the people at some point, if we have the technology to do that, we'll work on that in the next month.
Sounds good.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a little ominous.
Yeah.
Ripping giant screens up and down.
Thank you, though, man.
Yeah. All right. Next up, it looks like we've got Eric Z. All right. Go ahead, Eric.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Perfect. I'm Eric Zecchinelli with the Oregon Manufactured Home Association. We are in support of this for state lands. We think this could be a good opportunity, especially for more rural communities. These rural communities don't have capacity for vertical housing construction that might be above 2 to 3 stories. And manufactured homes themselves can cost anywhere up to $200,000, even lower than $100,000, and that's market rate. So a consumer can go in and purchase a manufactured home that's already set up, little as 10% down for their loan. So we are the only naturally affordable housing product out there, and it could be a good opportunity because the state could still lease the land to a manufactured home nonprofit or private owner, and then in turn they can make the revenue, but it reduces the cost for the homeowners because they're not actually purchasing the land. They're just doing a lease payment and their home stays on the property. They still build equity in their home, but they have an affordable payment for a mortgage, and then the state wins because they receive revenue along with the nonprofit being able to provide more affordable housing. And that's my only piece. I'll keep it short.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Okay, next up for testimony on state-owned land for housing production, Mark Landauer.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Landauer. I represent the Special Districts Association of Oregon. We certainly understand the need and desire to examine the ability of looking at state lands for the possibility of developing into affordable housing or housing of any type. The only thing I'd like to share with this group is sort of a ditto with regard to the message that Ariel Nelson shared with you from the League of Oregon Cities. In particular, our members provide water and sewer oftentimes to many of these developments, whether they're inside or outside of a city, and ensuring that the adequate capacities are available for changing a property from its existing use to a residential site will create different demands upon the infrastructure, and just want to ensure that if the group does decide to forward this, that coordination that was discussed by Ms. Nelson also is thought by the special districts, because we will end up serving these facilities on many occasions. So thank you for the opportunity and would be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Mark. Any other attendees interested in sharing testimony or comment on the, oh yeah, it looks like we've got one. Next up is Al Johnson.
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Al.
Thank you. Just a couple of comments. I'm a retired land use attorney. I've done a lot of affordable housing work over the years, and I've come across a number of issues relating to state lands. And I completely support the whole idea of making these lands available, but I just wanted to flag for the group that there are a number of issues that come up in different contexts. For example, state parks has adopted a rule requiring it to find an overwhelming public benefit to turning over any kind of its land, any of its land for any purpose in a land swap. Division of State Lands, of course, has to maximize returns for the Common School Fund. There are other state policies having to do with the preservation of school lands inside urban growth boundaries for future school use. So there's going to be a range of those policies which are not quite the same as infrastructure issues, but are going to involve institutional, you might call them turf issues, that you'll be needing to look at as you go through this. And I don't know how that'll be handled, but I just wanted to kind of flag the fact that there's quite a diversity of those kinds of constraints that will be turning up as you go through the filtering process. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. All right, with that, we're going to move to the second set of recommendations, expanding building codes division capacity. So all those interested in providing comment on expanding building codes division capacity, please raise your hand. All right, we'll start with Jonathan Balkema. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Hang on just a second.
We're having a hard time. You're real quiet. Jonathan, we're still just hearing some pings. Why don't we come back to you in real quick after Ariel testifies? All right, go ahead, Ariel.
Thank you. Just switching screens here. So on this piece, certainly supportive of increased capacity at the building codes department. We have some questions and potential concerns depending again on implementation on the details on the recommendation related to increasing or adding inspectors or independent contractors that the state would then use I think the intent is to speed up inspections and reviews at the local level. Certainly understand and support that intent, but want to caution that this could actually have the opposite effect if you're adding another layer of bureaucracy or another separate entity into the mix. We already have cities who, depending on the city layout and organization, are coordinating between multiple bureaus, sometimes different districts, through the public works, private utilities, could be public utilities. There's a number of checkoffs that happen, as many of you are aware, through the development process. And so we just caution adding another separate entity to that process. What we would support, would encourage to consider, funding could be coordinated through the state, certainly, or, in some way, but funding for cities to bring in contractors themselves to help with that capacity. The other issue is that folks at the state level are not intimately familiar with local codes and the way that local staff are. And so it's really difficult to efficiently kind of review and accommodate and get to yes on the approvals when you're not, when you're not at the local level. So that's another reason to encourage looking at other ways to increase capacity. And then there is a recommendation, I believe, related to, so there's something about tailoring a program to provide new state plan review and inspection services to cities which meet or exceed production targets established by the state. That one raised some flags for our folks. It seems like it could potentially be a disincentive for cities who are producing a lot or seeing a lot of production. So maybe tie it to cities that have high targets, high goals, requirements that, that they're going to be seeing a lot of housing development rather than high producing. Just want to think about ways to, I think the intent again is to focus resources where the development is happening, fully support that, but want to just be thoughtful about exactly how that gets implemented. And then there's the next one I think is expanding and fast tracking the state's role in meeting disputes. Fully support that. And we would just point back to the proposed Housing Accountability and Production Office that was proposed in House Bill 344, which the LSC supported in session. I think that was limited more towards the things under the DLCD and the Building Codes Department, but we would certainly support, and this could go back to relate to the recommendation, increased coordination and removing barriers at the state agency level, but, really creating a resource office between infrastructure, public works, building, planning. So just wanted to note that and encourage, using that framework potentially to provide that piece. And then I think the last one is providing resources, including education, to maximize the potential for virtual inspections with a target of 24-hour inspection anywhere in the state. So 2 pieces on the virtual inspections. We do have some cities who are doing this. It works for some kinds of inspections and some parts of the inspection process. I think one city shared an example of, I'm not a contractor, an engineer, but some venting things were up on a roof, and it was definitely more cost effective and much faster, less staff intensive to use a drone to do that. That's also very expensive. So virtual inspections will become a significant investment need that we would definitely need the state to fund to get there. And then again, not going to be suitable for all types of inspections, but happy to have a conversation about that. And then finally, a 24-hour requirement is just simply not realistic in the realm of possibility, at least today with our current systems and structures. Certainly support, exploring efficiencies and ways to make inspections happen faster and occur faster. And again, that comes down to capacity, aligning systems efficiency, which we are very much supportive of the conversation to get there.
All right. Thank you, Ariel. And it looks like we've got Jonathan back. I'm going to give it another go, Jonathan. Jonathan, are you there? Yeah, you're unmuted. You just unmuted, but we can't hear anything.
Now, can you hear me now?
There you are.
Perfect. All right. I apologize for that. So I'm Jonathan Balkema. I'm the building official for the city of Albany, and I also am a board member of the Oregon Building Officials Association. So on this particular matter, I think there could be some unintended consequences in the context of what the proposal is trying to do, which is increase capacity. So hopefully from a building codes perspective, we can have adequate or quicker turnaround times for plan reviews and inspections to do our part to make sure that we have housing production. So in that context, I did actually email Matt and the group, or Matt and the email group, a written version of this, but I had some suggestions to change it because the emphasis of the whole building codes division, now it's operated for 50 years, is we still have the local level and it's a needed part of development. So my proposal actually suggested language changes actually includes incentivizing the local jurisdiction. So like changing the title to expanding the building codes division and local jurisdictions to increase levels of housing production. In like building bullet 2, increasing the number of qualified individuals and entities who are certified in the state, because we equally have the same type of problem trying to find certified and qualified individuals to do plan review and inspections. And then to the tailoring the program to provide statewide plan review. One of the things to caution is that a lot of the state programs are built on funding between plan review and inspection. So if we end up stealing plan review away from the jurisdiction, either there's going to be staff cuts or potentially increased inspection fees to offset some of those things. So one of the paths to look at that, instead of making it a statewide process, more intended for programs that don't meet performance benchmarks that we already have with the state of Oregon. So my suggested language includes that. So look, changing it to local jurisdictions which do not meet program standards established by the Building Codes Division. And then to the 20 unit part, it's where the local jurisdiction cannot meet the plan review timeline specified by the local jurisdictions. So like in our jurisdiction, generally we are able to hit our timelines. So the need to go to the state is less, and that frees up the state to fill in where they absolutely need to instead of stealing away from the other jurisdictions. And then expanding the fast track to the state's role in mediation. I suggested some language changes in there strictly because this proposal is really geared towards BCD, and there's a lot of elements outside of BCD's realm. So I kind of twisted the language around to make it more emphasizing BCD's role in supporting the local jurisdictions, supporting you guys as developers to come to a reasonable understanding of what the code's intent is, what the code minimum requirements are, and get a project moving, and assisting in those other elements where it may be DSL or health authority through or DEQ for public works type elements. And then lastly, I had similar concerns that the league mentioned for the virtual inspection. So you would see in the testimony that I twisted the language around to conducting a video inspection within 2 business days of the request. Hours is hard for us, especially in the context of we don't work weekends. So an hours system doesn't work. And as the League of Oregon Cities says, that in general, a 1 business day type approach, a 24-hour type approach isn't feasible in all cases, even for a fully staffed jurisdiction. We can have staff on vacation, staff out sick, and only certain certified individuals. So having a bigger buffer is more appropriate. But the concept of the recommendations we have in there is really to still help provide the needed housing, but keep it focused to the local option, because when the State Building Codes Division came into effect, it was industry that actually asked for them to step in to help kind of overarchingly shadow the local jurisdictions, but not necessarily to take them over like a DMV approach. And we've all had our fun experiences with DMVs from the past. It is nice to still have that local approach and that local person you can talk to.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. And then HPAC members, you should have the markup that Jonathan was talking about in your email. I sent it just before the meeting. Okay, looks like that's all the folks we have to testify on the expanding the Building Codes Division capacity. So we will now move to revising condominium regulations and requirements. So any attendees who would like to provide comment on that recommendation package, please raise your hand. We'll start off with Ariel Nelson.
All right, thank you. So on these recommendations, certainly support work to reform Oregon's current condo defect statutes. It's past time to align with other states. I think it's a pretty understood barrier to condo development here. The one comment we have here is just to consider some pre-existing work and efforts done in some recent legislative sessions that I was not personally involved in, but could connect you with the folks who are and the legislators who led a work group not too long ago. I think there's some draft legislation available that could be consulted to kind of just pick up where that work left off and not reinvent the wheel. There are of course political hurdles and things like that, but in terms of a policy proposal, would be happy to share that just to kind of for your information and see what's out there. I think we have from the feedback I received from cities, the next piece about developing an envelope inspection standards to be inspected by local jurisdictions as part of the building inspection process to help reduce risk of defects. The questions include, would there be more funding and training attached to additional inspection items? Curious how this will be implemented. One note was that building officials and inspectors don't watch the entire process, so not sure how to ensure that there will not be defects, how the state work with local governments on this. So just would love to have more engagement and understanding of the specifics there. The next piece, recommendation, I believe, is clarifying the rules and roles for condominium documentation to keep out of local jurisdiction, provide information to cities, and help amending code to remove local guidance. So we had a conversation about this. I wasn't able to be there for all of it, but my understanding from our city members is that cities do not, by and large, do not have separate condo requirements. In cities, condos are subject to the same similar requirements as similar multifamily rental housing. And so we also, my understanding was that any duplicity was potentially already addressed in House Bill 3395 this past session, and that the portion of the bill that dealt with this was not anything that we had any concerns or opposition to. So just curious what remains, and maybe it is a matter of guidance and clarification, and would just note that any guidance, we would encourage that be coordinated and delivered through a future state housing office like what was proposed in 3414. A similar note on that housing office to use that structure for providing more state resources for approval and training code amendments. And then I just heard a lot of questions from folks about the piece related to airspace condominiums. Just wanting to know more about what the intent and what the benefit would be. Questions about who protects the person who purchased the property on the air plat and ensures they get what they are expecting for if those improvements aren't made initially. So just a note and a hope for a future conversation on that piece.
All right. Thank you, Ariel. Next up, we've got Jonathan back as well.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me this time. So on this one, mainly want to talk about the inspection element again. So this isn't the first time that this type of suggestion is brought up after the Construction Claims Task Force of the mid-2000s came around. The Building Codes Division was requested to add weather barrier requirements or water resistive barrier requirements to the low-rise residential code because of the defects that were seen at that point in time. And during that public process, it was recommended that we do inspections, and it was discussed thoroughly. Industry at that point in time had little interest in having the government take another required inspection, potentially slowing down their projects, because quite often siding installers, cladding installers are installing the water resistant barrier and the siding while they're in that one area. They're not wrapping an entire structure and then waiting for us to come in and inspect it and then coming back to do the siding. So unfortunately, quite often having a required inspection would actually slow down the construction process a little bit. Not scientific, but my understanding is City of Albany was the only jurisdiction that actually required them following the Construction Claims Task Force. We since stopped doing that in 2018 as we didn't see a lot of benefit to doing it, and most of the developers understood how to install water resistant barriers. The challenge to having it where it's a required inspection from the state building code standpoint is we're not familiar with every single product that's out there when it comes to a water resistive barrier, their specific elements that they require for which material is compatible with each other's material, what they need for their warranties, those elements. So it's adding an inspection honestly ends up being a false third party look at it because we're less familiar with the product. If the recommendation goes forward, the suggestion that I would have is direct it back to the architect's law and add that to an additional element that's required under their construction oversight. They are the ones that selected the materials in most cases. They've been on site doing the actual mock-ups of how everything needs to be put together. They're already doing construction monitoring, and they're already partially liable for any potential defects within the project. So it's in their best interest to make sure things are done right. Or I have talked to a couple people, and the other suggestion, and we used to do it when I was on the private side, have a third party come in and actually certify your water resistive barrier shell membrane, or the manufacturer themselves. One of the builders that I worked for, the company that we bought our house wraps for, they came in, they did the inspection, they gave us a 10-year warranty on it. So there's different options that are outside of adding an additional inspection. Unfortunately, that additional inspection will obviously come with costs, and that cost is going to vary on projects. Obviously, a single family house is going to be relatively inexpensive. If you're building a multi-story high-rise in Portland, getting an inspector around every single nook and cranny is going to cost a lot of staff time. So there's some concerns there. And then on the last bullet, the air condo of expanding down to the low end middle housing. Depending on what the true intent there is, does look like you guys left out duplex if the intent was also to allow 2-family dwellings. And then I did have a question on townhouses. Does that necessarily need condoizing in the context unless the intent was more like a CLT, since by land use rules, townhouse is already a single family, single unit type approach. So anyway, that's my comments.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. Next, Eric Z. Go ahead, Eric.
Hi there, my apologies. My comments are towards the permit applications. I raised my hand at the last moment. I'm not sure if it's still applicable to talk about that, or if we should skip over that.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to make a note, since there's so few number of us here, that wanted to go on the record as the Housing Association for Manufactured Homes. We do support every comment that Ariel Nelson made as well. She hit the nail on every single topic. We don't get a lot of problems in terms of permits for our jurisdictions, because we're supposed to have our permits back in 10 to 15 days required by Oregon law for manufactured homes. And that's because all of our homes are built and inspected at the factory, and then those are approved, ready to go, and then they're inspected on site. But everything that Ariel said, we also support as well.
Great. Thank you, Eric. All right. Well, that concludes the folks interested in testifying on the revised condominium regulations and requirements. So we will move to the final set of recommendations around a State of Oregon infrastructure fund. And we will start off with Ariel Nelson.
Hi, thanks. Takes just a second for me to get the authority. Okay, so on the state infrastructure fund, hopefully you're not surprised. As I mentioned, infrastructure is really the top barrier for what we're really going to need. Cities are unanimous in sharing full support for funding infrastructure. That's really going to be what's going to move the needle and make housing happen faster and cheaper and more affordably across the state. I want to make sure you get the opportunity to review the testimony that I believe you received in your emails from Clean Water Services. And I'm not sure if my colleague, Mr. Landauer from the special districts is on as well, but a really important point is to consider, those overlapping jurisdictions and districts. Not all communities have these utilities under the same roof. So really need to think about how such a fund would work. And think about, if we're funding some of these really important large infrastructure replacements or expansions, updates, that the benefits from that and the impacts are potentially going to benefit multiple communities. So if you're, very supportive of needing to focus investments and ensure that we're paying attention to where infrastructure and is going to overlap with where housing is being built, but need to consider the various players in that. Also want to be aware of the impact of potentially shifting costs of new development onto existing ratepayers. These are ratepayers that have already paid for their upfront share of water infrastructure capacity in our current system. And, this is a pretty regressive policy considering many of our low-income Oregonians across the state. So just food for thought. And then additionally, I think in one of my recent conversations, my understanding is that the folks who worked on this proposal are aware of and considering the work done in House Bill 2980, which is a piece of legislation that Senator Anderson and Representative Marsh sponsored this session. That was something that the league supported, and there are some really much smarter people than I working on that proposal, and we hope to bring it back in the next session. So we'd just love to coordinate with this council on building what the tool could and should be. And I think this is probably my last opportunity comment, so I'll just take the liberty to thank you again for this opportunity. And I just hope we can have some additional opportunities to sit down and have conversations and discuss these, really thorny, complicated policy areas and get some stronger understanding for the existing systems, what's working, what's not, and what the opportunities are. So thank you again for your time.
All right. Thank you, Ariel. Next up is Mayor Keebler.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I want to express the City of Bend's strong support for any recommendations talking about infrastructure funding for all the reasons that Ariel just gave you. This is so important for cities and is really one of the most impactful ways we have to unlock more housing and accelerate the housing that we're able to build. I also join in the recommendation that this council really consider looking at HB 2980's model and kind of that innovative idea, and maybe putting that on the table as well as a way to leverage future tax revenues in a way that we can support this revolving loan idea. We also wanted to ask that the recommendation take into consideration providing direct funding to cities. We have sewer infrastructure on our 10-year CIP list, that we will get to maybe eventually. If we can have some revolving loans and some injection of cash for infrastructure at the city level, we can build some of the larger projects that will unlock, for instance, in Bend, the whole Southeast area plan, which has a zone capacity for over 1,200 units and 2,800 jobs. For Bend, really the focus is on wastewater systems, including water, stormwater, and sewer. That's very expensive here and is often a barrier for projects. We've seen, particularly on some affordable housing projects that we've pushed through, that us stepping up, moving a project up the list and getting some sewer done really made that project happen. So for this fund, we want to be able to use it in both those more nimble project focused ways and also in that larger area plan, concept plan way to help make sure that land is available and ready for development. And I think you've heard a theme today also about making sure that any of the initiatives and recommendations from this group really talk about how we support affordable housing. I would add middle housing to that. We have a report that our median house price in Bend is $800,000 now. That's out of reach for way more than just the folks at AMI. So up to, the traditional is up to 120% AMI represents that middle band. They are hurting here in Bend too, and we need to, I think, bring that into focus as well as all of our low income and affordable housing as well. And then just the other point is, if you want to look in Bend, what the priority is for us would be our expansion areas. Those are the areas from our 2016 UGB work that still are not quite developed in providing the housing yet. I think, again, there's a lot of opportunity to accelerate future housing with infrastructure investment. So setting up a statewide fund, however that looks, and getting that going as soon as possible is really going to help us meet that goal that the governor set to produce housing. And I would just ask if you want to consider adding, someone from Bend. Our staff are great as a stakeholder in your conversation, just to represent Central Oregon as an area. We would love to be part of this conversation and continue to push this idea forward. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Mayor. Next up, Al Johnson.
Thank you again, Matthew. I just wanted to jump in and second everything Mayor Keebler had. I'm back in Eugene now, but I lived for 7 years in Bend, and during that time I co-chaired the technical advisory committee for the update of the housing element of the Bend Comprehensive Plan. And everything that she says about Bend's willingness and commitment to really addressing this issue is absolutely true. It's been the most amazing city I've dealt with in my 50 years in housing and land use in Oregon. They're an amazing outfit. And I wanted to also second her comment about the areas, the expansion areas. There's a lot of sort of emphasis on making sure that affordable housing has access to transit and is walkable. Those are all very important things. But it's also true that historically, the BIPOC community, lower income people of all ethnicities and races had great difficulty in accessing some of the really terrific amenities that we provide. And we have a tendency in Oregon as elsewhere to provide those amenities like new parks and new schools and those kinds of things at the urban growth boundaries or close to urban growth boundaries for the same reasons that everyone else likes to do that, because the land is cheap out there. It's easy to do, easy to put in services. So Bend has identified some areas that are appropriate for affordable housing, even though they may not be as close to transit. They are close to the best schools and close to the best amenities. And those are the true opportunity areas in many parts of our state. So you need to think about that as you're drafting the criteria for where property gets developed and where the funding goes. And I just want to bring that out. And again, I second everything the mayor had to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Al. I guess this is final call for testimony on the State of Oregon Infrastructure Fund recommendation. Oh, Councilmember Wood.
Hey, Matt, I wanted to ask kind of a follow-up, just a quick follow-up question for Ariel. Just something she said that I wanted to ask about is there was a comment about existing ratepayers already paying for stuff. And I want to make sure that myself and the members of the committee understand. So up until I think kind of the mid 90s, early 2000s, when we started really seeing SDCs take off, I think the cities used to pay for a lot of this needed infrastructure, water, sewer, transportation, all that stuff. And then it's only kind of been in the last 20 years that you've really seen that take off and the SDCs kind of become what they are. So I want to make sure I'm understanding that. Is that correct? I'm trying to figure out how the existing ratepayers have paid for some of these things if they were part of capital improvement plans and SDC improvements and stuff.
Thanks for the question. So I think that our comment was in response to a piece of the recommendation that said something about, this would move away from reliance on SDCs and would transfer or kind of spread the cost burden of paying for new infrastructure on more of the population at large. So I think when we've had conversations about, SDCs in the past, we just really want to make sure that folks understand that cities have basically two tools when it comes to paying for infrastructure. It's the system development charges, and there is some ability to raise utility rates, but again, that has that regressive impact, right? The other thing that happened in the last 20 years and why you've seen such this shift towards SDCs were measures 5 and 50. So property tax reform remains a top priority for the league. And if this group is really swinging big and hitting for the fences, we would love to have you join our property tax reform party. It's a long road. There are some barriers there, but cities simply have completely compressed and restricted available local revenue. We have, I'm at the Oregon Mayors Association conference today, and it comes up in every other topic. My shorthand for property tax reform, that's not my issue area, but it's the why we can't have nice things as a state, right? Local governments used to be able to better fund, better plan for infrastructure, core services, all of these things. When we're talking about homelessness, everything that relates to everything folks are really wanting to try and improve. So that's the big piece right there.
All right, thank you, Ariel. And it looks like we have one other person who would like to comment on the State Infrastructure Fund, Peggy Lynch. Go ahead, Peggy.
Thank you. Yeah, am I there?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. This is Peggy Lynch with the League of Women Voters of Oregon, and thank you all for all the work that you are doing. The League was not planning on making a comment today, However, the last question by Mr. Wood made me want to make sure that you all understood that back in the 50s, it was the federal government that paid for much of the infrastructure. And the truth is, that's why 50 years from those days, we now have failing infrastructure in cities in their current sewer and water programs. So it makes it more difficult. And Ariel, thank you very much, made a comment about measures 5 and 4750 when the local governments lost the ability to have enough money to pay for their regular services, such as fire and police, etc. It makes it more difficult. After all, debt service also has to be paid. So the last thing I want to say is certainly the league supports some kind of an infrastructure fund. And we are looking forward to seeing what kind of structure that you actually come up with. What's really important is to make sure that the structure allows for the opportunity for the state to access federal IIJA and IRA dollars. We cannot, the need is too great. We cannot do it with our state revenue alone. So we really do need the ability to make sure that this fund, whatever you come up with, works to make sure that we can access as much money as possible. That's enough for now. Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity.
Thanks, Peggy. I also saw, Mark, did you want to provide some comment? Hold on, let me unmute you real quick.
Thanks, Matthew. I was just going to correct Ms. Lynch on one point. The federal government paid for nearly 65% of water-related infrastructure up until the late 70s. And since that time, the percentage of federal funding coming for infrastructure has dropped precipitously. I think it's somewhere around 10% now. So the struggle for, as Ariel had described, is true. The other issue for districts, districts don't have revenue choices. We are creatures of the statute and are therefore only allowed to do what the statute allows. So for our water and wastewater systems, our revenue possibilities are even more slim than cities and counties, generally speaking. So I just wanted to make that quick point, Matthew, and thank you for allowing me to just do so very briefly. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. All right, well, with that, it looks like we've concluded public comment. I will turn it back over to our co-chairs.
All right, thank you, Matt. And just a quick thank you to all the folks who have been taking the time from the community to sit in on some of the work groups and get informed on these recommendations and provide your feedback. It's really appreciated and will be considered and taken into account as we move these recommendations forward here. So as to moving recommendations forward, I kind of want to take these things one at a time. You know, we have an opportunity to, as a council, have a discussion about these here, you know, whether it's the substance or something that you heard from testimony or something that you've been thinking about and reviewing the recommendations on your own time or in the work group setting that you'd like to discuss as a full group. But then we're going to need to decide what we want to do with each of these recommendations. The default, if we don't decide to do something else, is that each one of these recommendations will move on to meeting 3, at which point we kind of, you know, we will call the question as to whether or not to finalize the recommendation in meeting 3. So I do believe we, for some of these, if the consensus of the group is fairly clear, that the recommendation's in good shape and we don't want to beat it up anymore in the work group or go back and edit it additionally, then we have the ability to adopt the recommendation here in this meeting. But if we do not do that, it will be it will come back and be on our agenda next month. So that's the posture that we're in. And so I want to start at the top, just in the order we've been going through these, with the recommendation about state lands and property, and open it up to members of the council for questions, comments, discussion, and see if anybody would like to hold forth on that.
Damien, I'll go.
Go right ahead.
So as a member of the work group who worked on that recommendation, I thought the feedback from the public was quite helpful and very constructive. And I don't think that it necessarily substantively would change the recommendation meat of it, that we could move forward, but that we would want to keep much of the public testimony as consideration for the next steps of implementation. And so I am happy to jump into your encouragement, Damien, Co-Chair Hall, to try to move things forward so that we have additional space on future agendas for more discussion. So I would recommend that that one's ready to go forward, and welcome any discussion on that.
Thank you, Alyssa. I feel the same way out of all these. I think it was the one that had the least amount of comment that was constructive criticism or consider changes and this type of thing and the other. So one, dare I say, least controversial perhaps is that recommendation, but I've got a couple hands up, and so we'll go through that. I see Daniel and then Joel. I hope that's the order that you raised your hands in.
Sure, we'll go with that. I think it's ready to go. I just think it's important to state for the record, we got good comments about conflicting agency priorities. And I think we all know that that is, very, very common when it comes to different branches of government. My understanding of this, and I think this should be reflected as the understanding of the group, is that we're recommending an executive order, and that executive order, when drafted, would instruct agencies to amend their OARs or amend their policies to be consistent. And so if that's what our understanding is, then I think it's ready to go. And that's really just a note for Matt to say, hey, when you're looking at this in a few months, remember to put that language in there. But otherwise, I think it's ready to go, and I appreciate the testimony and all the work that went into it.
If I may, real quick, I want to clarify. I think the terminology is more about constraints, like not necessarily policy, but actual constraints on those lands, like for protection for natural resource, cultural resources, things like that. So I want to make sure that's stressed as well.
Yeah, and so like parkland might be, if you buy it with funds from the Land Water Conservation Act, you're deed restricted, that's federal funding. I don't think there's anything we can do about that, but I think there is a component that has to do with the culture of an agency. And if they own something, clearly, if you work for that agency, you think that's very, very important. And we're encouraging the governors to use the bully pulpit and her executive authority to say, your project's important, but this is also important.
Yep.
All right, very good discussion, and let's move on to Joel. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Hall. And I want to just start by saying I agree with both Alyssa and Daniel as far as this being ready to go. I want to pick up on two comments that I've seen or heard. One around concern with proximity to services. And we were intentional in working on this recommendation to be focusing on properties, state-owned lands within urban growth boundaries. We know that the proximity to services and infrastructure is there within the urban growth boundaries more than outside of those. So we were intentional about that in this recommendation. I also want to acknowledge the public testimony that was, or written testimony that was submitted by 1,000 Friends and Cities and Towns Program Director, Central Oregon Land Watch. And in their comments actually provided great research on kind of the next steps of publicly owned land recommendation that the Land Availability Work Group is working on. So the one before us today is state-owned lands specifically. We know we're also working on this more broad publicly owned lands in urban growth boundaries too. And I just wanted to acknowledge that and appreciate the public comment now that will help us shape future recommendation as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Joel. And feel free to raise your hands if you got additional thoughts on this topic. But while folks consider whether or not they want to chime in with anything else, I do want to just thank the land availability work group for your good work on this and a very thorough recommendation. And it's great to see, and it's not the first time. We had at our first meeting, we considered the round one recommendations. It's great to see how thoughtfully many of the issues that have come up in the public comment have already been discussed at the work group level, and how there's a considered approach in each one of these proposals. So I'm not seeing any additional hands. I'm gonna assume, and that's always dangerous, that we have a bit of a consensus just related to this one recommendation. I'm going to ask Matt a verbiage question. If we move this to adopt, am I saying that to adopt a recommendation, to initial adoption of a recommendation? What is the nature of the thing that the motion, I think, that I would want to say?
We would want a motion in a second to preliminarily adopt this as a recommendation, and then I'll do a roll call.
Okay, so we do a preliminary adoption, knowing that at the end of this process, end of the year, we'll have an entire deliverable and we'll package everything together. And then, the real final adoption will happen kind of at the end. But preliminary adoption, basically the idea is, hey, this recommendation is in good shape. And if you believe that and think that, you would vote yes. If you don't, you would vote no, and we'd have a discussion about it. All right, I see Margaret, you got your hand up.
I would like to move preliminary adoption of the recommendation before us today on state-owned land.
Thank you, Margaret. Much appreciated. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Fantastic. Moved and seconded. We have a motion pending. Before we do the roll call, any further discussion from the members of the council? All right, I'm not seeing any. So Matt, would you like to do the roll call voting, please?
Sure thing. Senator Anderson.
Aye.
Representative Dexter.
I think she just stepped out.
Director Bell.
Yes.
Director Bateman.
Aye.
Co-Chair Hall.
Aye.
Co-Chair Tubby.
Aye.
Councilmember Bunn.
Aye.
Councilmember Flagan.
Aye.
Councilmember Gertler.
Aye.
Councilmember Olson.
Aye.
Councilmember Mills.
Aye.
Councilmember Fonseca.
Aye.
Councilmember Rajbeda.
Aye.
Councilmember Matthews.
Aye.
Councilmember Madsen.
Aye.
Councilmember Wood.
Aye.
Councilmember Rockwell.
Aye.
Councilmember Van Vliet.
Aye.
Councilmember Janney.
Aye.
Councilmember Hill.
Aye.
Councilmember Cody.
Aye.
All right, unanimous.
All right. Well, thank you, folks. I appreciated that. Good.
One down,
So
two
we
more to
have,
go.
yeah, preliminary adoption of our first recommendation. It feels good, but yeah, more to go. And so to that end, let's talk about the next recommendation in front of us, expanding building codes division and capacity. we got some feedback on this. I think, you know, because the recommendation was focused at expanding at the state level, I think there, you know, the broad strokes of the comments on back were concerned from local jurisdictions that could potentially happen at their expense or cause friction or some version of that. So noting that there's always going to be a tension between local control and state direct authority and being the state being involved in housing production, and that, you know, I'm not sure that we can ever quite find the perfect balance that stops us from getting comments from either side. Let's open this up for discussion amongst the members of the council. Tom, go right ahead.
Thank you, Co-Chair Hall. I think it draws, you know, obviously when we have a motion or a recommendation like the last one, it's relatively uncontroversial and or is unanimous. We don't necessarily confront how much available to each recommendation as it is finalized. And I guess we've heard some comments and or a few concerns around this one. Is there the ability after a preliminary recommendation is approved to kind of quote unquote dial it in or refine it between now and the time it becomes final? And then to what extent are work group members who were involved in its drafting, to what extent are they involved in that refinement, if that is a possibility?
Those are good questions. JD, I saw you come off mute. Do you want to take a first run at that, or would you like me to?
Yeah, I thank you for that comment, because I think it's one thing that we are worried about, or at some point finding a fatal flaw. At some point, we don't want to put a recommendation up if some unknown fatal flaw comes up. I think the other purpose of the chairs of the various work groups getting together and working on these as time goes on is to also try to identify any unintended consequences or overlaps or conflicting impacts between various recommendations. So we're hoping to catch most of those, but I think it's more procedural and more kind of like in the event of a fatal flaw type thing, with the acceptance or the understanding that a lot of these details, these are recommendations. They're supposed to be relatively general. And so upon the recommendation, there's a whole political process and a finalization process on the back end when they're actually instituted. So, and I'm sure many of you will be invited to participate in that process as well with your background and the work on this. So I'm sure that this is not the end of any of these projects until they're actually finalized by the governor herself or through action through the various departments or through the legislature.
Thank you. That's helpful. It may be helpful for us in terms of our functionality to have some system by where the work groups, as recommendations are developed and then considered, we have a kind of tiering or a prioritization of what we feel is kind of foundational or critical to the recommendation and what we feel might, you know, is not, and therefore maybe can have additional work and refinement and or fleshing out around it. Just a suggestion.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that there is ample opportunity to, you know, kind of have tiered recommendations, right? Like say, hey, here's the thing, and there can be optionality within recommendations and different things. And I think that, you know, this, just my perspective on this is each one of these items has is a policy concept that can be pushed either in a more progressive or more conservative way. And there's a whole bunch of iterations on it. And so the idea behind these recommendations, the stage that we're at, when I say, you know, kind of ready to go as a concept, is do we know what that recommendation actually means? What is the concept that's being proposed? And do we object to that concept? Not that could it be incrementally made better if you tweaked this, that, and, you know, various elements of it, because I think that there is always healthy debate to be had about any given one of these recommendations. And then, you know, we're also walking that balance of at what level do the recommendations come in and how much detail, and knowing that no matter what we do, there's always going to be open-ended questions about implementation and how a thing works and becomes reality and all that we can't, you know, in any meaningful way cover off, right? Like, so even once it goes through the legislative process and becomes law, there's, you know, we can still ask open-ended questions about implementation, right? So we have to kind of, I think it's a bit of a balance, but it's really about, are the members, in my mind, as far as, you know, are voting and moving things forward, are the members of the council confident that they understand what the recommendation is, and that, you know, that kind of fundamental recommendation is something that we're supportive of. And then I think there was also a bit of a question as, you know, is there fine tuning and tweaking? You know, I would like as recommendations get preliminarily approved, I would like the work groups to kind of move on from them and delve into the new things. That being said, there is a body of work that has not started yet, but sort of how do we turn the preliminarily approved recommendations into our final report? And the idea is that it's not just a cut and paste job, right? So there will be some, you know, modification of them as just far as like the language and describing them and kind of, you know, we want to do some thinking about how do we best categorize these things and fit them together. You know, as JD was mentioning, there's going to be overlap between some of the recommendations, and how do we present the final thing? And so there will be some, you know, some editing, some of those type of things. But again, back to, if we know what the recommendation is, we can figure out how to mix and match those, just as opposed to, you know, here's a set of recommendations from one work group, next work group, and we just stack them all on top of each other. So those are all the kind of, you know, things to consider. But I think just for our purpose today, do we understand what the recommendation is? Do we feel comfortable with that recommendation in the form that it currently is? Our touchstones. Okay, so 2 more hands. Natalie and then Daniel. Go right ahead.
Oh, Daniel was up before me, so you want to go first, Daniel?
No, I will yield my time to Natalie and I'll go second.
You're both so gracious. Natalie, go right ahead.
I generally am fine with the edits that Jonathan had proposed, save for number 4, item number 4. I would like to have that stay the wording as is. I would like there to be, and perhaps maybe eventually, if we can do as a work group a recommendation related to the Housing Accountability Production Office. This is an item that could move out of BCD and into that HPAC office. But I do think that we need to have a place for the state to be a mediator with disputes for all aspects of projects, not just building codes. So that is the reason why I would like to see number 4 stay as is. So that's just my comments.
Okay, and so before we hop from that to Daniel, I want to, you know, reframe that into kind of what we're doing here today, right? So if the idea is we want to take a recommendation and accept a number of changes based on comments from different folks in the community and commentary we've received, I think we should probably, you know, not preliminarily adopt it here in this meeting. I'm not telling folks what we need to do, but if that's the direction, I don't want us to necessarily utilize the full council as a way to go through, you know, the details of each of these. It's really, are we ready to, especially while we're in meeting number 2 out of 3 on any recommendation, if we're thinking that it needs some level of responsive change to testimony we've received. Let's do it in between now and meeting number 3 would be my suggestion to the group. And that's agnostic of any of the content of any of the changes suggested. So
I just wasn't sure if it was like, sometimes you could say adopt motion with X changes, or if this was a area that we were discussing if we were discussing as an HPAC, what changes we'd like to see so that it could come back for the 3rd meeting to be adopted.
Yeah, so again, I think if we're gonna adopt something in the 2nd meeting, we need to have a fairly obvious consensus around it, or else we'll take it to the 2nd meeting. We'll have is for things where we've got a consensus. If we want, wholesale changes, and I saw the letter. I mean, I didn't read through every single thing, but there's a number of technical edits. So I want to make sure that the work of the work group is being given justice and all that type of thing, as opposed to just adopting wholesale a number of things that I'm not, we received earlier today, and I don't know if I can speak in detail and accurately about it. So if we're going to do long story short, if we're going to do a bunch of changes, let's do it before the 3rd meeting and utilize the work group structure and have a considered discussion about it. Not trying to quash discussion in this setting, but knowing that, we've got work group members who have worked on this for a while. We've got recently received comments, and we've got a bunch of folks who are not in the work group that worked on this for a while. And I don't want to assume anyone's level of comfort with any given change beyond what we can kind of wrap our arms around here. So Daniel, go ahead.
So in the thinking that this may go back before final adoption, I really like in general, the changes coming from the building official from Albany. I agree with Natalie on number 4. I'd probably leave that one. It's vague enough that I think it's important for the state to mediate things in addition to just what building code regulates. I also take issue with number 5. I know that 24 hours is tight, but I think the solution there isn't to just loosen the standard. I think the solution that was proposed is we need to find a way to deliver quicker inspections. So I would favor keeping it at 24-hour, and it does say that it's a target for 24 hours. It's not saying 24 hours or it's automatically approved. So I think it's important to keep a little bit of pressure on. And most of the time, a lot of jurisdictions can hit 24 hours, and I think that's a reasonable target, especially when you're weighing it against the emergency nature of what we're dealing with. Question for the people that were on the committee: for number 3, that recommendation switches it to the state providing resources to jurisdictions who do not meet their targets. Is that where you were intending to focus the resources? Was the state building code division will come in and deploy extra resources or make another path available for jurisdictions that aren't hitting their targets?
No, I don't think that was the intention. I think it was really the broad proposal is to increase capacity at the state level, and it wasn't really to limit or to somehow take work away at the local level. And so I think some of the comments are good. I think if we're going to take those edits, and I think we need to consider them. I don't really want to do it on the spot, and I think we would need to rewrite it and make sure that we've kind of thought about all the consequences, because a lot of thought went into getting it to this point, and I would be disinclined to say take those edits and have that discussion without at least some careful thought with all the group.
Right, and I also want to reiterate, about the need for the 24 hours. It is written broad, like, maximize the potential for virtual inspections with a target of 24. That's a lot of conditionals that I think that are in that sentence. And so I think, as part of the, the governor's intention on this is to be bold and to be aspirational. So I think having a goal and ideals about this being aspirational, I think you're okay. Once again, this is not the end of this process. It has to be instituted into departments, has to be instituted through either, through executive order, through legislation, or other ORS. So there's a lot into this. So I think being aspirational with some of those, flexibility language in there, like potential, maximize, targets, things like that is okay. At least on that one item.
I think a reoccurring theme that you're going to be hearing from jurisdictions is there's a tremendous amount of new legislation and requirements that are burdening the jurisdictions. We need help. And so I think to the extent this is recrafted or fine-tuned in work group, I think crafting the language to make sure that this is in support of, and this is in addition to, and because I think what you see going on behind the scenes here is local jurisdictions saying we need more resources. Don't give those resources to the state. But I think this is a great recommendation, and I think a lot of good work has gone into it, and I think it'll benefit from another round.
All right, so I'm sensing we have a situation where we've gotten some really good comments. The majority of which the folks who worked on this and are in the technical details of this seem to support, but there are some points of discussion, and it sounded like from what Eric said, it would be useful to take this back and have a little more discussion with it at the work group level between now and our next meeting next month, which sounds like a good process. And so we do not need to take a vote to do that. And so I would just be inclined to pass that, keep moving from this item and just have that as the direction. And Eric, just look to you to incorporate that into the agenda at the work group level. I think
Damien?
something. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, should we vote to table it or to send it back? It could be a voice vote. I don't know.
I don't think we need to do any of that. By default, it'll show up again and meeting number 3 of round 1. But if we vote to do something, then it'll be, we would vote, something else would happen. But so I think we can have the work group come back, do some edits, similar to what happened between meeting number 1 and 2, where work groups, took up the pen and touched up some of the technical stuff. I think we can keep that process going without needing to do the roll call vote thing.
I just didn't know if it with any instructions or not. So if it automatically rolls into that process, then I think that works fine.
Yeah, and then I want to just acknowledge that there's always going to be a tension between state level, local level, who is benefited by any given policy, who sees it as a threat, etc. There's everything that we touch, there's some embedded interest in some level of protectionism, and we need to identify accurately and quantify impacts and mitigate those impacts, but we can't solve for necessarily everybody's concern. So I think at the political process is charged with solving a lot of that, but if we can do a really good job of being really accurate and identifying the concerns that are raised to us and documenting those so that through that process those can be addressed and mitigated, and through our process as well, I think we're in good shape and furthering our charge as a council. Okay, so let's jump into number 3. Pulling out my note, condominium policy. Another one we heard, and this is, I think, something that comes up each time condo reform comes up. There's some state law about when local government should should get the ability to review condo plats, and local governments think they should have more ability to review condo plats, and state law says they should have less. And so, you know, that's all playing out again in the comments. I'm not particularly concerned with that. I think that there's a, you know, as some folks said, there's a recent law that was passed, but would love to hear comments and thoughts of the council on anything you've been thinking about, hearing about on this recommendation regarding condominium law. Justin, go right ahead.
Well, I will just say from firsthand experience, and I don't know if anybody else is doing this, but I'm currently doing a 13-unit condo project in Southeast Portland right now. And we are going through the process. And I will tell you, it's the first time I've done it, and it is a pain in the you know what. So it is very difficult. And actually, to Portland's credit, Portland isn't the difficulty on this, but navigating the Multnomah County and the state processes that we have to go through to get this has proven very difficult to get through. And in an era where we're trying to encourage more condo development, just getting through this process has made me question wanting to do more condo development. So I just that for the record there.
Fair enough. Streamlining the process and decreasing the amount of risk on the back end, I think, is the general goal of the recommendation.
Yeah.
You know, so I think, you know, hopefully we're advancing the ball on that side. But any other additional thoughts, comments on the specifics of the recommendation, on any of the testimony that we received?
Sorry, Damien, one other thing I wanted to add, sorry, that I mentioned.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've also built in some other jurisdictions in Washington, and one of the things I heard Jonathan say earlier, talking about the inspections, you know, a lot of us, if you're using a designer, you don't have an architect on the project. You know, largely, you know, larger projects might have one, but smaller projects, like we just have a designer and no architect, so we wouldn't have some third-party architect come out and do an inspection. It seems to me like, I mean, this seems like a good starting place, but other jurisdictions I've worked in other states do require envelope inspections. So I don't think Oregon never has, but I don't think it's a big stretch of the imagination to require a building inspector to do a third-party inspection. Obviously, I mean, not a third-party inspection, but an envelope inspection. And I think the builders probably don't love the concept of it just as a added inspection, but if it's a trade-off between a 10-year statute of repose and a 6-year statute of repose, to do a third party, I mean, to do an envelope inspection, I think that's a trade-off a lot of builders would accept.
All right, acknowledge. I think that, yeah, I think your statement is true as well. I think that is a, you know, the back end tail on some of the condo things is a huge issue, and the cost of insurance associated with that and all those things. Natalie, go right ahead.
Yeah, just a further comment on the building envelope inspection part of this is that it was written such that BCD will develop the inspection. And so just like you were saying about this isn't the end of the process in developing that, we're not saying that it has to be done. We're saying we're deferring it back to building codes to develop it, to provide that extra assurance for the building envelope. So I just wanted to add that clarification in there.
Right on. Thank you, Natalie. And I think that's a good point that we can take down, as far as, you know, that's not a finished concept, and that we, you know, take that kind of the feedback that we got about how that inspection could be more or less burdensome depending on the building type and all these type of things. You know, that it should probably be right sized to the project. And make sure that that's you know, reflected in this recommendation going forward, and as things are implemented. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I move preliminary approval of this recommendation, provided all discussion has been heard.
Second. Okay. All right, moved and seconded. Opportunity for any final discussion? All right. Hearing none, Matt, let's take a roll call vote.
Senator Anderson.
I'm an aye, yes.
I assume Rep Dexter had to leave. I know she was traveling, so we'll go with Director Bell,
Yes.
Director Bateman,
Aye.
Co-Chair Hall,
Yes.
Co-Chair Tuvey,
Yes.
Councilmember Bunn,
Aye.
Councilmember Flagon,
Aye.
Councilmember Gertler,
Aye.
Councilmember Olson,
Aye.
Councilmember Mills,
Aye.
Councilmember Fonseca,
Aye.
Councilmember Rajbadia,
Aye.
Councilmember Matthews,
Aye.
Councilmember Madsen,
Aye.
Councilmember Wood,
Aye.
Councilmember Rockwell,
Aye.
Councilmember Van Vliet,
Aye.
Councilmember Janney,
Aye.
Councilmember Hill,
Yes.
Councilmember Cody.
Aye. Sorry.
Motion's adopted.
Fantastic. All right, thanks, folks. Great work. And before we move on to the infrastructure discussion, I'm just going to take a little bit of chair's prerogative and say, Director Bell, I really like your art. Great background. It's cool.
Appreciate
Every time you come on, it's like, I'm like, oh shoot, look at that. But
All credit to my mother. Appreciation.
right on. So let's talk about the infrastructure fund. We got some commentary on this from different sources, all very positive. I want to take a moment to recognize that this recommendation is framed, I think, in a very useful way as far as an objective of a fund to create to help pay for infrastructure costs. It does not try to solve the problem of who pays. You know, there's a lot of policy discussion, and we got some comments around, who pays the progressive tax, this and that, and I think that there's, in our process and coming out of the finance work group, there will be opportunities to delve into those waters. But that this particular recommendation is about, there should be a fund for infrastructure, not take the money from here and put it in the fund for infrastructure. So I just want to make that distinction, and know that all is coming in this process, most likely. All right, so opening it up for comments, discussion of the council. Margaret, you got your hand up. Go right ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair Hall, Co-Chair Hall. So my colleagues on the work group are going to know for sure that I am a broken record. I love this recommendation, and I think it can be improved by basically merging it with the House Bill 2980 concept. So a couple of our commentators in writing mentioned that, and it was brought up today, I think, by Ariel. And that does provide the 2980, couple things. It was pretty well vetted, and it made it through Rep Dexter's House Housing Committee. And so that speaks to me of some, that it's ready for prime time. It's my understanding special districts and county assessors were consulted. And it does provide a mechanism that's a twist on, and I'm out over my skis here, but it's a twist on property tax increment that repays the fund. And so the concept is the state capitalizes the fund. It revolves because repayments come from future increase in property tax revenue. So I'm out over my skis. We may want the work group to hear from folks who work directly on that bill. As much as I want to move our recommendation forward, I'm going to recommend that we spend a couple more weeks on it and bring it back next time. And I hope I'm not voted off the island by saying that.
All right, thank you, Margaret. Much appreciated. So, because, and only because you've heard yourself as a broken record, it sounds like this is something that has been discussed at the work group level. Is there a 2980 like recommendation or discussion on the agenda? Or
there will be when the consent calendar for the next meeting is adopted. So at our last finance meeting, we spent time at the end saying there needs to be a serious revenue raising discussion. And so if I was a betting man, I would say that there will be a separate recommendation coming up with a menu of funding options that may be applicable to more than one solution. Margaret is a broken record. That's perfectly fine. She's an incredibly valuable part of the cacophony of noise that we have in finance. But I like how Damien started out and said, this is a recommendation for, we need to target infrastructure. I think it's a separate discussion about how we raise the money. But having said that, for the final work product, those may get merged together. So I think the question is do we have any material changes on what we're saying this program's for? And there's a couple of policy areas that I think we need to discuss as full HPAC, and then we can decide, do we want to try and bundle funding with this, or do we want to split it out? There's also a couple of other companion pieces that are coming up. So Deb's group has a recommendation forthcoming that would add a little bit more clarity about how this money is spent and some more parameters around that. Finance has a recommendation coming through for a parallel program, but targeted towards environmental improvements. So how do you pay for wetland mitigation or tree mitigation that's preventing you from using your buildable lands? So I think we're going to get those 3 or 4 probably all adopted. Then there will be some sort of reconciliation process at the end to hammer that into a coherent final product. So I think it's more of a procedural thing, not to argue directly against Margaret, because I think you're right. I love 2980, but I don't know that we need to shoehorn it into this particular recommendation.
Yeah, and I would just, stepping back and seeing the forest for the trees. This is not the only recommendation with questions about where does the money come from to implement the recommendation, right? So I think we're going to have a suite of recommendations about like policy, then there's going to be questions about funding, and we're going to, I don't know that we need to tie a particular funding source to a particular recommendation, because, talking about increasing the capacity of the building codes division, how do we, fund that and all that, so each one of these has that sort of question and that kind of dichotomy. So thank you. Thank you all. And then, so I want to give Karen the opportunity to go next. She's had her hand up.
Thank you. I wanted to say I really support what Margaret was saying as well. And I understand potentially not commingling, but I think 2980 really needs to be something that we look at and integrate in. I also think, and I'm excited, and I really like the public testifying today about how we really do need to look at property tax reform. And Daniel and the finance group, I know, is very much now going to be focusing on some of the broader strokes with that, and understanding that that has to be a responsibility of this group to bring forward the systemic issue that we have there, and is very excited about. I'm excited about these progressions. I do think that it is our responsibility in the role that we have to bring forward. And Matt had said this early on. He's like, you don't have to hammer out how we're going to raise the revenue for it. And yet I think a lot of our recommendations will fail if we don't be thoughtful about that piece of it, about how it can be funded, or where funding will come from for those pieces. So I think what I'm concerned about, and why I think Margaret was flagging this particular one, is if we don't weave some of the recommendations together with, and this is the logical source of income for it, or this is where you can see it, or this is maybe why mortgage interest deduction on second homes is important, then I don't think that we would have as much impact in getting some of the recommendations passed. So I like the direction we're going. Thank you.
Right on. Thank you, Ken. And I'm seeing some hands come up here. I'm gonna ask JD to go first, but then Deb, you had your hand up and you're off mute, but then the hand went down. So I'm trying to read the tea leaves on that one. You good?
I don't need to speak. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Go ahead, JD.
So I heard a recommendation that the infrastructure team should reevaluate the state land taxing system. Is that what we wanted? No, just kidding.
Well, yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's a way to kind of split the baby on this, because there's obviously we don't want to tie ourselves in knots about funding, because there could be a whole slew of things that we may have or not have any power over, or it is entirely through a negotiation. But I do see the point of, like, we need to at least have some ideas, some possibilities. But I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to tie ourselves in knots about that, because that may not have much relationship to what the actual outcome is at the very end. I think it's good to think about it, and I think might be some good ideas about it, but I don't want it to hamper our process on making the recommendations. Because I think, and I keep going back to the original charge of some of the words the governor said, is like, be bold and be aggressive, especially in urgency, and I just don't know if that gets too much into the details and nuts and bolts about where funding comes from. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think all perfectly good points. I'm hearing that, while this recommendation may not, in its current form, does not have a funding source or funding sources attached to it, that the finance group is going down the path of looking at different funding sources, including, and I'm forgetting the number, it was 2980, House Bill 2980, and so that is on the docket, on future agendas, that type of thing. If you do take a look at, from the consent agenda, there were some funding source related concepts that were, entering into the discussion as well. So I think that there's going to be, along with 2980, other concepts that get discussed about how to raise funds. And, I think we want to be thoughtful about kind of earmarking those to a particular recommendation, right? Because it could, it could be that infrastructure is the number one thing, and that's where they should be attached to, but it might be a discussion and that type of thing before we go down that path. But identifying the mechanisms and places where we think that there's viability to raise funds in the current legal and political environment, I think those are great topics that I would like to see in future recommendations. So more hands are up. I think, Tom, your hand was up, and then over to Daniel.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, I concur with the comments of my colleagues previously. I think it's a both and situation. It's not an either or. I think infrastructure is one of the biggest levers that we need to pull as a committee. I also think the finance groups, and thank you to the co-chairs there, the finance group is beginning to dig into data around, we know that housing is holding back our employers and our state from achieving its full potential, and our citizens. And I think we're doing some research around what is the economic impact of every new housing unit that we can deliver. And I think that is actually going to be potentially profoundly helpful in justifying this and other funding mechanisms that enable development that would not otherwise occur. So we're just getting into that. So I think we're looking forward to coming back to the full committee with some more information.
Absolutely. And I fully support that analysis. You know, who benefits, who's the world of folks that benefit from, you know, increased housing production. It's the people that move into the houses and the people that build the houses. Yeah. But, you know, I think there's also some state contractors who represent very large portions of the state budget who would also benefit from those sort of things. So we should, you know, maybe take a look at that. Daniel, you got your hand up. Go right ahead.
So it sounds like the finance committee should come back in round 3 with a recommendation that has finance options. And we should go through the analysis, the pros and cons of each, why there's a logical nexus to housing.
Let me stop you there. I was going to take that a different direction, Daniel.
You're going to tell us we don't have to do it at all?
No, I was going to say, you know, come back with recommendations that are separate from the one we're considering right now for sources of
right. That's what I mean. Yeah, come back with a new recommendation that's just standalone talking about revenue.
Oh, round 3, not meeting 3 next month. Okay, got it.
No, round 3, yeah. So at the end, and then at the end, we're all going to look at it and say, okay, this revenue makes sense, this revenue doesn't. And then if we want to, we can pair particular revenue recommendations if we think there's a good argument for it, but we don't actually have to cross that bridge today, the pairing of revenue with a particular recommendation. We can wait till the last step.
Yep, and I think, you know, if there's a direct nexus and things seem to go together well, great. You know, revenue sources, it's intent. You know, there's not. It's good to identify innovative and concepts that are new, but you know, that is such a political discussion that we would need that it's very difficult to prioritize amongst those type of things.
And I don't want to limit. I don't want to kill a bill by saying we would like to fund this by repealing Measure 50. And then if, you know, well, we can't repeal Measure 50, then we're not funding infrastructure. Well, no, I think we got to trust the governor to be able to piece together funding. She's a pretty good Speaker of the House. She knows how to move bills. So I think we can give her our ideas, but that's a political sausage making thing. So if we can put a pin in the revenue talk, there's a couple of policy questions I wanted to highlight for the whole group. Is that okay if we take a couple? Oh, I see Joel's got his hand up, but do you mind if I talk through those, just to make sure they're highlighted for everybody?
And therefore I will take my hand down. That's all good. I wanted to make sure we hit that. So
go for it.
All right, can I share my screen? Let's see here. So since round 1, we made, can everybody see that?
Yeah.
So the version in your packets is a little bit different than what you saw in round 1. We tried to respond to some of the questions that came up. So there's 4 buckets of changes. I'll walk through them, and there's a couple that need some real policy discussion. So number 1, we were a little wishy-washy on if it was a grant or a loan. And so this proposed change is to make it a revolving loan fund that is conditionally forgivable. So it's revolving in the sense that somehow it gets seeded and the money comes back to it. And it's conditionally forgivable in that we'll loan you the money, but if you hit certain targets, it's forgiven. And the reason the committee liked that route, or the reason I like that route, and therefore I hope the committee fully agrees with me, is that it's a lot quicker to get the money out if we structure it this way versus saying, well, you got to apply, show us your housing, show us your affordability levels, and then we'll send it to you. If we want to get money out the door, let's get the infrastructure built, and we can figure out on the back end how much gets forgiven based on how you hit your targets. But we don't want to get stuck in a process where it's 2 years of NOFAs and analysis and scoring committees before the money gets out the door. So that's change 1 that came from discussion. Change 2 was defining critical infrastructure. So there was a lot of questions about what does critical infrastructure mean? Great question. We don't know if there's a definitive answer, but here's 3 different stabs at it. HPAC, we can all vote to pick one of the options. We can put all 3 in there. I don't know that it matters too much because that really is an implementation detail, but a lot of people raise questions about what the definition of critical infrastructure is. So these are 3 different ways to attack it, and they're listed in this packet just as option 1, option 2, option 3. I don't know that anybody on finance had a strong opinion anyway on any of the different options, but there they are for your consideration. And the third one is talking about the mechanism of the forgiveness and trying to bracket some of the dollar amounts. So like Tom said, we're doing some research on what the economic benefit of a housing unit is. So we may come back at the end and maybe adjust these numbers. They're placeholder numbers really, and it is just a recommendation. But the important concept is a jurisdiction is going to come to us and say, hey, if we do this improvement, we can build 200 houses. And the fact that they think they can build 200 houses will size the amount of money they get. So we think that we want the funding to be tied to the amount of housing they produce. And it's interest only for a few years, and then it starts amortizing down. And the reason that makes sense is because if you're going to apply for forgiveness, we would rather you get the housing built and apply for forgiveness sooner rather than later. So if you're coming to us for forgiveness in year 14, well, you've already paid off the bulk of the debt, so there's not that much forgiveness. But if you're bringing us houses in the first 5 years, it's been interest only, and you're getting your full principal balance paid down. And then number 4 is, or well, no, we made it part of number 3. How much forgiveness do we do? Now, this is a complete straw man table that is up for the group, and I would like to call on Mr. Cody to speak because I know he feels very strongly about it. But the concept is that there's some sort of easy to understand rubric that says, if you bring us a C of O for a unit with these characteristics, we will forgive X. I like round, even numbers, and you'll notice they all magically go just by 5% because it's very pleasing to me to see the table like that. But I don't know if that's the right thing to do. There's a very good argument to say that 60% below AMI should be 100% forgiven. We heard testimony today that in the no affordability category or no restriction market rate category, why are we incentivizing for 3 bedrooms or more? All good questions. Again, not sure how much of that's on the implementation side versus where we're at, but I think it's important to have something that shows the intent. The reason I scaled it this way comes from the affordable housing side where we know there's a deficit of 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom units. And so I like seeing a little more subsidy when you get the 2-bedroom and 3 bedrooms, but I don't know if that makes sense on the market rate. So having said that, I will now be quiet and hopefully there will be voluminous policy discussion that will resolve all those questions.
All right, thank you, Daniel. And I do want to open it up for discussion. If the volume can fit in the next 9 minutes, that's great because that's what we have scheduled. If not, I'll check in with everybody and see how we can, who has availability to stay on so that we can make decisions accordingly. I appreciate the approach. Tom, I see your hand. Want to just throw out my support for keeping all 3 options in there, marking down and making note that, these are numbers that are conceptual. I think it's a good follow on from our prior discussion, right? You got to know what the funding source is and how big the fund is before you can really size any and scale any of these loans, and what the forgiveness plan is and how to make sure that the thing makes enough money and doesn't give away too much money so it's perpetual, et cetera. So that all of this is kind of approximate in the first cut, and once we have real dollars, we can right size a lot of that and make policy decisions between different unit mixes and that type of thing. So with that as my suggestion as the chair, Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the prompt, Daniel. Just quickly, I mean, Daniel, my colleagues know on the finance group, I'm just a big advocate of not tightening the box so much that we limit production. So I'm going to, as we work on this, be a proponent for expanding that forgivability component. I think anything 120% or below that has a deed restriction is enormously valuable to the state and to our production goals. And we also haven't done much yet in the work groups regarding workforce, middle income housing. So I think that would be a big statement that the state is finally getting behind middle income housing. We've been directing billions of dollars to affordable, which is great, and we need more. But I think that would be a move in the right direction. Thank you.
Right on. Thank you, Tom. All right, well, I'm not seeing additional hands up, but want to give folks a moment to do so. If you're harboring any last comments, questions, etc. Otherwise, I see a hand. Joel, go right ahead, man.
Thank you, Co-Chair Hall. So, appreciate the work on this. So I'm trying to reconcile the land availability infrastructure discussion and the finance work group. And we had some presentation in the finance work group about that. And one of the pieces for me that's really critical and what I appreciate about the land availability recommendation is that some of the programmatic elements of it. And less so like how does the product roll out and get forgiven, more so how is it prioritized by what local jurisdictions are lifting up in their capital improvement plans, connecting it to the housing needs that are identified in their buildable lands inventory, housing needs analysis. And I understand the need for flexibility in this type of investment to span the housing spectrum. I also really appreciate the comments about prioritization for housing units where the market won't provide. And I don't see that yet in our from the finance committee, which I'm a part of. And I know we've had these conversations, recommendation, and I still think we need to have that in our recommendation because that advances us toward equity. So I've shared that before in the finance committee. I wanted to bring this to the full HPAC as well.
Okay, appreciate it. And I think that comment goes a little beyond the last chart. I mean, that's an element of it about how many bedrooms and what the level of forgiveness is, but it sounds like even prioritizing amongst scarce resources might also fall into that wasn't in the chart. So just wanted, I think that's right. I see Joel nodding. Okay, all right, want to be clear on that. Karen, got your hand up, go right ahead.
I wanted to support what Joel was saying, but I also wanted to acknowledge that Daniel did a really good job, and I like the even 5% increases as well. I want to call that out. Well done. But I think something that we're struggling with here is prioritizing and bringing up equity in those spaces that aren't built, but we also are in a space where we don't want to be creating disparities because there is this portion in our society right now that isn't getting subsidies and isn't getting supports for housing. And that is what we're talking about when we're talking about the up to 120%. But it can't be done at the expense of not expanding the housing stock for those that are also our most vulnerable. So I think that we're needing to be very conscientious about that. And call it out. And if we had to make decisions as to priority decisions, again, I'm biased because of the population that I serve, but that bias I think needs to tend towards those who are the most vulnerable without supports, which would be our lowest income earners in our communities. But I'm glad we're having the conversation because there is an acknowledgement right now that there's this space that isn't getting subsidies and they're also struggling to make ends meet in Oregon with housing affordability.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate that discussion. And this is going to be something that I think tracks through a lot of the work of this committee, right? Like the concept of how do we, create units that serve the most vulnerable, knowing that the market won't create those itself. Versus how do we, utilize available and limited resources to produce the most number of units, and those may not always be the same concept. And so, I want to avoid the temptation to try and solve that in this particular recommendation. I do like what I was hearing about some of the analysis that Tom and Daniel talked about, getting into the data about what are the economic impacts of a lack of housing, but B, housing production if we're successful here, so that we can, in a very informed and, quantifiably driven way, make those kind of policy decisions in recommendations, especially around when we are recommending funding sources and kind of implementation and those type of things, because that's just a valid debate that, you know, in my mind, there's not like a one right answer to. I think the way that our charge as a council has been framed, we need to do all of it and find a way to do all of it. But, you know, at the same time, there are, you know, realistic barriers about what do you do first, and decisions need to be made. I'm just hopeful that they don't need to be made in this particular recommendation, and that after we call on these next couple of folks, we can take a vote. But if not, we'll send it back to the work group and talk about it next month. All right, Council Member Hill, go right ahead, sir. And just a heads up to the group, we are at time in 1 minute. Are folks able to stick around for a resolution of this last matter? I'm seeing head nods. All right, Riley, go ahead, sir. You're on mute.
I have to sign off and get out of here, but you know, we don't spend enough time on the 120 on the workforce committee to put more workers into our community and to put more tax dollars back into the system. And of course, our group is working to get more information, and we will. But I'm going to leave you with another thought. We're never going to double our housing production unless you go into the ratios of the workers, of electricians and plumbers. And I've made my group sick talking about this on workforce. But unless we get more plumbers and electricians out there and change those ratios, we're never, ever going to produce this housing. And so this might be in the weeds, but it has to be done. So I got to sign off and thank this group for all their work.
Thank you, Riley, and appreciate that. And I understand it's percolating up from the weeds into a recommendation about ratios coming out of the workforce work group. So we're looking forward to that as well. And thanks for your good work on that. Daniel, go ahead.
Briefly, one other component, we talk a lot about forgivability of the loans. It also functions as just a regular loan program for jurisdictions that need to build a plant and want to pay it back over 15 years, which is great for smaller jurisdictions who might not want to bond. And with that, solely out of procedural interest, I will move to grant tentative approval to this recommendation with the statement that if you vote against it, I'm not going to take it personally, and I would also be happy to take it back to committee. But let's see if we can see where everybody's at.
All right. And not to be too persnickety, but preliminary approval being the same thing.
Preliminary approval, excuse me, I'm sorry.
It's less tentative than tentative. Do we have a second?
Preliminary tentative approval.
All right, I saw a second from Eric. All right, any further discussion before we do a vote? All right, Matt, please, with the roll call. Oh, wait, Tom, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think maybe I cut out before, but I really want to encourage us, you know, taking a look at those brackets and expanding those brackets. I just think it's unnecessarily limiting to have those brackets be, I think if you're deed restricting, 100% forgiveness is appropriate if you're deed restricting at those levels of affordability, at any level of affordability below 120. I just feel strongly about that.
Okay, and you know, so that we're on the same page about what we're voting on, my understanding from how it was presented, that chart that we saw at the end was indicative of, you know, a framework and an approach and a level of clarity that would be beneficial for the loan forgiveness concept, but not actually but is more of a placeholder as far as actually the substance of that chart. So any given percentage in there, there's no real way to know what that should be or shouldn't be absent a funding source, and how much money the state has, and the objectives for how do we, you know, how much money do we put on the street and keep the thing perpetual, et cetera. And so, but I do hear you on, you know, wanting to up the percentages of forgiveness when there are in certain circumstances around deed restriction for affordability. And I think we have the ability to note that, to make a particular note that the chart is not intended to be hard and fast of specific numbers. but
Thank you.
contains a lot of policy decisions that need to be considered and made. All right. Any further discussion before we go to the voting? Okay. Let's do
Senator
it, Matthew.
Anderson,
Aye.
Director Bell, Director Bateman,
Aye.
Co-Chair Hall,
Yes.
Co-Chair Tuvey,
Yes.
Councilmember Bunn,
Yes.
Councilmember Flagon, Councilmember Gertler,
I like where we're going, but I think we need to talk about it more, so I'm gonna vote no.
Councilmember Olson,
Yes.
Councilmember Mills,
No.
Councilmember Fonseca, Councilmember Rajvaida,
Aye.
Councilmember Matthews,
Aye.
Councilmember Madsen,
No.
Councilmember Wood,
Yes.
Councilmember Rockwell,
Yes.
Councilmember Van Vliet,
No.
Councilmember Janney,
Yes.
Councilmember Hill, Councilmember Cody.
Yes.
All right. So I assume, Matt, you're tallying, and
Motion
it sounded
fails. 12 in favor. Majority of the council is 13.
okay.
Or technically it's 12
So-
and a half, but it's not half plus one, so motion fails.
Okay. All right. Let's do some procedural things. So all of the folks who voted against that, hopefully some of you are on the finance committee and can sort it out in the finance committee area, work group area, pardon me. So, heard a couple of things. Additional discussion on who benefits from the fund and particularly from forgiveness of the fund and how. And my suggestion is that I don't know that we're really all going to run that to ground and that it needs to be in this recommendation, but maybe it needs to be. And then getting folks comfortable that revenue sources are going to be discussed in a way that is satisfactory to the folks that are to the council members. So I think that's where we're at on that one. This will be up for meeting number 3 in a week, or pardon me, in a month. We'll see what traction and edits we can make and what conversations we can have between now and the next meeting of the full council, and we'll go from there. Right on. Well, I think that we've done a pretty good job of having some substantive discussions about where we're at, identifying where we've got consensus, identifying where we have some more work to do and conversations to have. And we've moved 2 out of 4 of these forward. So I feel like it's all in a good HPAC meetings work. So thank you so much for that. I see one hand up. Natalie, go right ahead.
I see on the Matthew had sent out a tentative meeting for the 25th. Are we not having that?
No, we are having that meeting. So the next meeting will be in 2 weeks on August 25th.
Okay.
And maybe that's a good segue for me to just roll into next steps before we close out. So one, just appreciate everyone's time. appreciate the folks that came to testify, appreciate the active engagement of the council. I know how much time that everyone's putting into this, and the governor does as well, and it's appreciated. Just, I want to make sure to communicate that. So we do have a meeting scheduled for August 25th. The initial planning, and I think I'll need to talk with the co-chairs at our check-in next week, had been that if all of the recommendations moved through at this meeting, that we would take up a new set of recommendations at the next meeting. So I know a lot of the work groups are working toward that timeline. So I'll talk with co-chairs Tevye and Hall on Tuesday. We'll get some guidance out, but I think for now, don't stray from that necessarily. Some options are to, have a third meeting of this round, maybe have a split meeting structure. We've got a third meeting of this round, and we move into a first meeting on the next round. So just wait for some additional feedback. And we should get that out to folks by Tuesday afternoon. So that's where we are. And just, again, appreciate everybody's time that they're putting into this.
Right on. Well, with that, unless there's anything else for the good of the group, I think we're at the adjourning point. And thanks everybody for staying a little later here on a lovely Friday afternoon. Hope everybody's having a wonderful next couple of weeks before we see you again. And thank you for the great conversation and all the hard work, both in this setting and in the work group setting, and all the stuff offline and all the thought and conversations that everybody's had. It's evident that folks are really giving a lot of meaning to this work, and I appreciate that. It makes my job a whole lot easier. So thank you, and looking forward to more conversation. Take care, folks.
Have a good weekend, everybody.